Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Amelia Friedman, and I am an attorney with the Children's Immigration Law Academy. We're pleased to be able to offer today's webinar on children's asylum and gang-related crimes, or alternatively, the webinar is called Children's Asylum and Gang-Related Claims. This will be a 75-minute webinar, and it's being offered as part of CILA's pro bono initiatives. I want to begin by discussing what we plan to cover today. So our goal in offering this webinar is to provide information about gang-based asylum claims, especially for pro bono attorneys or anyone interested in volunteering in children's immigration cases. We appreciate you being here to learn more about these cases, and we're going to be going over some ways that you can get involved. If you're an advocate at a legal service provider, welcome. We appreciate all your work and are happy to have you here too. We hope that the country conditions information will be relevant for your clients. I'm going to start us off shortly with a brief introduction to CILA and our pro bono initiatives. My colleague Serena is then going to provide some background legal information about unaccompanied children and children's asylum law. Please note that this is meant to be more introductory and to set the scene for our discussion on country conditions, which is going to be our focus of today. We're very grateful to have with us Thomas Boerman, who is an expert on societal violence in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and he's going to be giving us a presentation on current country conditions. We're very grateful again that he's taking the time to talk with us. And after his presentation, we do hope to have some time for a short Q&A. I'm then going to provide some additional information about CILA's pro bono platform and opportunities for attorneys and non-attorneys, including law students, to support children's asylum cases. We're also going to hear from Delaney Swink, who is a pro bono programs manager at the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center, about some of their volunteer opportunities and pro bono work in this area. And I'm going to close this out with some information about how to stay in touch. Just a couple housekeeping items to go over. First, as I mentioned, we are hoping to have some time for a short Q&A with our country conditions expert. We ask that you please ask questions related to the subject matter of his presentation, what he's covering, the conditions in the countries, and not necessarily case-specific questions or questions related in general to being an expert. Unfortunately, we won't have time to address those today. My colleagues Serena and Sachi are going to be helping with monitoring the questions, and we ask that you submit them using the Q&A box and not the chat. We do have a handout for today's webinar. It has been posted on the training page for CILA's website. A link to the website, this particular page, was in the reminder email you should have received about an hour ago from Zoom. It's also, I think, going to be shared in the chat. Thank you, Sachi. And the webpage will also include PDFs of the slides for today. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording in a few weeks is going to be posted there as well. We are able to offer CLE credit in the amounts shown on the slides for today's webinar. I do want to flag that there are some requirements you need to meet in order to be eligible for CLE. So this is for anyone who, again, is seeking CLE credit only. First and foremost, we ask that you please join the webinar today and register using your own name and email. So if for some reason someone forwarded you a link and that's how you accessed it, and you do want to seek CLE, again, this is just for CLE purposes, we would need you to re-register and join using your own name and email. That's to help us track attendance. We also want to note that partial credit will not be provided, and I am going to be giving a CLE participation code later on. I'll give it verbally. It will also be shown on the slide. Please take that down, and you will be asked to provide it in an attendance confirmation form, which I will be emailing after the webinar. We have had some issues with those emails going to spam, so especially if you use Gmail, please check there. If you are wanting to seek CLE and you don't get the form by tomorrow, you can follow up with us via email. And again, there is a process for attendance verification. And then after about a week, you would get an email from the ABA MCLE department to follow up and confirm it. So some information, a little bit more about CILA for those of you who may be new to us. We are a project of the American Bar Association's Commission on Immigration. We are an expert legal resource center, and as the name suggests, we focus on children's immigration law. We're a capacity building organization, and we're here to help legal services staff, social services staff, and pro bono advocates. We're based in Houston, Texas, but our work is nationwide now. So we have written resources, trainings like this one. We also host working groups. And again, we have both legal attorneys on staff as well as social workers to provide services. I want to talk a little bit more about our pro bono initiatives in particular. So CILA does support pro bono coordinators, and we also have resources that are meant to help specifically pro bono attorneys who are working with children, especially in immigration cases. One of them highlighted on the slide is our pro bono guide for working with children and youth. This is a comprehensive document. It's available for free on CILA's website to download, and we encourage you to check it out. We also have recorded 101 trainings, which can be very helpful for those new to working in this area, and we do CLEs like this regularly. Another thing we want to do is connect interested volunteers with available cases throughout the country. So to do that, we host what's called CILA's Pro Bono Matters platform. This is on our webpage, and we have partnered with legal service organizations throughout the country to post available cases in children's immigration. So just to show you a little bit what that looks like, this slide has some examples of case cards from our platform. And you can see they have the name of the organization, a little bit about the case. They also will often say if the opportunity is remote or if mentorship is available and where it's located. You can search the database of case cards to find something in particular that you might be interested in. Once you find a case that you're interested in, great. It's very easy to express interest. Each case card has a button in the bottom center, and you will click that, type in your name, email, and number, and hit submit, and that will connect you with the posting organization. They will then follow up with you directly to see if it's a good fit. You can also share opportunities. If maybe you have a colleague who's interested, you just click the button in the bottom right, copy the URL, and send it to them, and so they can check out the case cards too. And then finally, I just wanted to share, these are the organizations that CILA is currently partnering with to post cases on our platform. You can see it's a bunch of great organizations throughout the country in a lot of different states. If you are located in a state that's not on here, don't worry. We do have some remote nationwide opportunities available too, and I'm going to be talking about those a little bit later in the presentation. But now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Serena.
All right, thanks, Amelia. Hi, everyone. My name is Serena Bhatia, and I'm an attorney here at CILA. So we're first going to talk about who are unaccompanied children. So who is an unaccompanied child? First, a note on terminology. Federal statute refers to this term as an unaccompanied alien child, or UAC. And as you can see on the slide, we've crossed out the word alien. As advocates, we prefer not to use this word as it is dehumanizing to the children that we work with. Instead, we prefer to simply say unaccompanied child or unaccompanied immigrant child. Recent changes to federal policy also reflect this perspective. So the statute defines an unaccompanied child as an individual who is under the age of 18 years, has no lawful immigration status, has no parent or legal guardian in the US available to provide care and physical custody. So in other words, it's a child who enters the US without a valid entry document and who was not accompanied by a parent or legal guardian. Oftentimes, this determination that a child is unaccompanied is made by a CBP officer at the border, but it can be made by other government agencies as well. A few other things to keep in mind. It's important to remember that youth are more than their legal status, and they may or may not carry the unaccompanied child designation. For instance, not all children who face deportation are unaccompanied. If they enter with a parent or legal guardian, then they are considered accompanied and are placed in removal proceedings as part of a family unit. Keep in mind too, that a youth who is designated as an unaccompanied child when they enter may eventually be reunited with a parent or guardian in the US. So it does not necessarily mean that youth who receive this designation remain on their own entirely in the US. And finally, being an unaccompanied child is a legal designation that typically follows the youth throughout their case and gives them special funds. While less common, this determination that a child is unaccompanied may change over time depending on the child's circumstances. So it's important for advocates to be aware of current policy and trends when working on children's cases. So looking at where are unaccompanied children from, based on data released by ORR in fiscal year 2023, 79% of unaccompanied children were from Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador. Looking at the data on this slide from the last 10 fiscal years, you can see a decrease in the percentage of youth from El Salvador over the last couple of years. There has also been a steady increase in the percentage of children from other countries. Still, historically, this data shows that the vast majority of unaccompanied children are from Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador. Here we're looking at recent ORR data through a different lens. So you can see that statistically, an unaccompanied child is most likely to identify as an adolescent male. Border encounters have been lower in this current year, but note how high the numbers have been the last 3 years. Taking all of this into account with the data from the previous slide, the majority of unaccompanied children in the US identify as male, are over the age of 14, and are from Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador. These kinds of patterns in migration and demographics are exactly why it's so important as advocates to be familiar with country conditions in this region and to keep them in mind when working on children's asylum cases. So with that perspective on unaccompanied children, we'll now look at the basics of children's asylum law. At the end of the presentation, we will be providing additional resources related to asylum law generally, but for now, we wanted to provide this legal background for those of you on this webinar who may not have worked on an asylum case before, so we'll just be covering the basics. So first of all, who is eligible for asylum? If an individual has a fear of returning to their country because of past or potential future harm, it is worth considering applying for asylum. So in order to qualify for asylum, an individual must meet this definition. A person who is unable or unwilling to return to their country or avail themselves of their country's protection because they have suffered past persecution or have a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of one of the 5 protected grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, or PSG. Note that the persecutor may be a public or a private actor. If they are a private actor, the government must be unable or unwilling to control them. Unaccompanied children who apply for asylum have certain legal protections afforded to them under the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, what a mouthful, or the TVPRA. First, unaccompanied children are exempt from the 1-year filing deadline for asylum. So generally, asylum applicants must submit their application within 1 year of their last entry into the United States. However, unaccompanied children are exempt from this requirement. Second, unaccompanied children are exempt from the safe third country rule. The United States has a safe third country agreement with Canada. So under this agreement, individuals must apply for asylum in whichever country they pass through first between the US or Canada. So if an unaccompanied child travels through Canada on their way to the US, they would still be eligible to apply for asylum here in the US. Third, and very importantly, unaccompanied children have the opportunity to apply for asylum in a non-adversarial setting. So this means that unaccompanied children's asylum cases are heard in the first instance by a USCIS asylum officer at the USCIS asylum office instead of at a contested merits hearing before an immigration judge. This is a significant protection because it applies even when a child is in removal proceedings. In that situation, they still have the opportunity for a non-adversarial asylum interview. Now we'll look at considerations for advocates to keep in mind for gang-related asylum claims. First, you want to determine if the persecution feared is on account of a protected ground. This, of course, is an issue in any asylum case, but gang-related claims may require more digging into the facts in order to build the strongest case possible for a client. Membership in a PSG is meant to be a catch-all ground that is commonly used in a lot of gang-related claims, but it can also be really difficult to craft a PSG that meets the legal requirements for immutability, social distinction, and particularity. For that reason, we suggest exploring other protected grounds, such as the youth's political opinion or religion, if the facts can support that gang members targeted them based on one of those grounds. Second, legal research is crucial because the elements of asylum are mainly defined through case law. So asylum law is established through decisions by the Board of Immigration Appeals, or BIA, which is the tribunal that reviews appeals of decisions by immigration judges. BIA decisions are nationally binding. From the BIA, cases can be appealed to federal circuit courts, and as you know, circuit courts may rule differently on legal issues. So you'll want to be aware of BIA cases as well as the circuit law that is applicable in your client's case. Again, this is especially important for gang-related cases where the law has been prone to change and there have been some unfavorable updates to be aware of in the last few years. Third, remember to raise all viable arguments in the asylum application. This slide has a non-exhaustive list of fact patterns to keep in mind when working with unaccompanied children that may give rise to a gang-based asylum claim. There may be facts relating to gang recruitment, family members being targeted, gender-based harm being committed, and then as mentioned above, religion or political opinion-based harm. This is also why it's important to understand the gang-related conditions in a country to be able to know what types of potential claims to screen for when working with children. And finally, what role do country conditions play in asylum cases? So country conditions are evidence for your case. As we hear from Tom about Central America, let's think about how that factual context could be used to establish the different elements of an asylum claim, such as government action or meeting the elements of a PSG or connecting a fact pattern to one of the 5 protected grounds. It's also really important when working with unaccompanied children for advocates to understand the factual context of the child's country of origin. Approaching your clients with cultural competence can really help build rapport. And as they share more about themselves and their experiences with you, you can in turn identify facts to support and strengthen their asylum claim. Turning now to the main event, which is country conditions in Central America. I'm excited to introduce our first guest speaker today. Thomas Boerman is a recognized expert on country conditions relating to societal violence in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. He has provided expert testimony in over 1,000 immigration cases since 2006. We invited him here today to provide information about the general and factual context in Central America. He will not provide any opinions on case strategy or law. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today, and I will hand it over to you, Tom.
Okay, well, my pleasure, Serena. Greetings, everyone. I really appreciate the invitation to be here. I really would jump on any opportunity to present this kind of information to anyone who's involved in these kind of cases. I've done these sorts of trainings for the asylum office before, actually have attempted to organize them for judges, and unfortunately it hasn't worked out, but oftentimes for attorneys and advocates. And it's just so, there's so many critical factors because each of you enter into these kinds of cases with good hearts and a lot of professional skills and the best of intentions. But these are oftentimes extraordinarily difficult kinds of cases to navigate. So I'd like to today touch on some of the things that I've found over the years to be the most critical. Let me say up front, like probably a whole bunch of us recently have either had COVID, have it right now, or will soon have it. And I'm in the have it right now and getting over it camp. So periodically my voice just kind of bottoms out. So if it does, bear with me because it'll be back in a couple of seconds. Before I do anything else, I would invite anyone to feel free to contact me by email at the address on this particular slide. I'm always happy to consult with attorneys about the facts of their cases and help them disentangle what's going on, because oftentimes these things arrive on your desks with very little fleshed out information, or it just looks like a big pile of spaghetti and you look and say, okay, how am I going to untangle this stuff? So anyone feel free to reach out to me if I might be able to be of assistance. Amelia, if you want to bump us up to the next slide. So these are a list of considerations that are going to apply whether your case is from El Salvador, Honduras, or Guatemala. This question of who are unprotected minors, I'm not dealing with it at the same level Serena was. She's talking about it from a legal standpoint in the United States. I refer to it as a socio-political, cultural context of Central America. And over the years, I've defined 4 different groups of unprotected minors. And this is important because in each of the Central American countries, there are reasons that account for the visibility and vulnerability of unprotected children and youth. And those factors and their visibility oftentimes prove to be critical in the legal matters that they're now confronting in the US. So group number 1 are children and adolescents from either female-headed households or households that are headed by elderly folks like grandparents or young caretakers like their own siblings. But there's a lack of an adult male protective presence in the house. Second group are young people who have a male presence in the house, but that presence is toxic. Drug and alcohol addicted, criminal, gang affected, sexual and gender-based violence offender, either towards the children and or the adult spouse. Number 3 are children living on the streets or without any kind of meaningful structure in their lives to protect them. And number 4 is a group that can often be interesting. Young people who have crested over the age of majority in their countries, but who, for a host of social, cultural, economic reasons, are completely unable to attend to their own basic needs without an intact, protective, supportive family structure around them. So this is important for you to work through with your young clients. What exactly is their status with regard to their level of protectedness or lack of protectedness? Because like I said before, that visibility and vulnerability in society oftentimes accounts for why they were targeted for harm in the first place. Second question, you will see a lot of cases where the young people are referring to, oh, they tried to recruit me to the gang. They tried to force me to join the gang. The adults in their lives may use that same terminology, but it's oftentimes used in a very ham-handed manner. So you need to ask some questions. Was this a case of gang recruitment where they were trying to recruit the young person as a member, which entails benefits such as money, protection, power, status, others of the benefits that come with being a gang member? Or conversely, were they just coercing this young person into service? Maybe because they're an unprotected minor, maybe because, and I'll get into some other reasons why this occurs, but it's very, very common that young people are actually targeted for coerced service to gangs, generally criminal service, drug trafficking, collecting extortion, things of this nature, but they're not made there's no offers of benefits to the young person. There's no promises of money, protection, status, power, girls, guns, drugs, all the goodies. They are simply forced into service under threat of death or harm to themselves or their family members. And the thing that's critical about this, number 1, this is not gang recruitment. This is coerced service. And that coerced service very, very often aligns to definitions of human trafficking up to and including modern day slavery. But the kids themselves, and oftentimes the adults in their lives, will use terminology like, oh, they tried to get me to join the gang, or they forced me to be a member. You need to really untangle this with them through a series of questions like, did they offer you money? Were their approaches warm and fuzzy and of an inviting nature, or were they menacing and threatening? Were there other promises of benefits? The family issues Serena touched on. What's the dynamic between the gang and other members of the family? Has there been past threats or victimization or harm? Have other members of the family previously fallen into disfavor with the gang? And the reason this is so important is that one of the two really fundamental principles of the strategy of terror upon which gangs operate is the targeting of family members of people who have either fallen into disfavor for whatever reason or are being targeted. You basically exert pressure on the individual by threatening and harming their family. It's one of the really principal means by which gangs establish this immense amount of psychological control over the population in areas that they dominate, is by saying, hey, it's not just you that's going to threaten, or we're going to threaten, harm, or potentially kill if you defy us, challenge us, rebuff us, but the people you love most. So exploring the family dynamic is really critical. The religion and political opinion oftentimes intermingles with these claims in ways that can be really critical, but oftentimes unexplored. The religious piece is important. Say you've got a young person who says, oh, they were trying to force me to join the gang. They wanted me to sell drugs or to deliver drugs to somebody in the school and pass them off. I'll oftentimes say, hey, this may seem like kind of a squirrely question, like out of nowhere, but by chance, are you and your family involved in the church? Oh, yeah. My dad's a pastor and my mom works for the church's office. Oh, interesting. And I'll start to probe that a little bit. What about you? Oh, well, yeah, I'm in the youth group and I go to services. How many times a week do you go to services? Oh, usually about 4 or 5. Well, you begin to unravel this and you see that this is a young person and from a family who is very recognizable in their neighborhood or small community as being people of faith. And that the gang members will very, very often approach young people, and also sometimes not so young people, who are known for their practice of faith and impose these demands of coerced service on them. Number one, because there's this presumption on the gang members' part that, hey, this kid's got a reputation for religiosity, and nobody's going to suspect him or her of criminal involvement on our behalf. This happens all the time. Young females are targeted for unwanted sexual relationships, in part because of this perception that the gang members have that, unlike a lot of gang girls, she's really clean and she's pure and she's not like having sex with everybody in the gang and everybody in the neighborhood. And I have this hope for my life that someday I'll be out of this nightmare of gang lifestyle. And I'd sure rather have a woman in my life or a girl in my life who's not like, one of them that's getting passed around by the gang. So this religious piece is really, really critical and oftentimes can shift the nexus into one of a very legitimate religiously based claim, as opposed to other potential arguments within the framework of the law. All of this is true with political opinion too. And I'll touch on this in a minute, but gangs are clearly recognized in areas where they really dominate as being political actors, either de facto authorities or even parallel authorities that are, at times, it's not an exaggeration to say that they operate within a system of co-governance between the state and local officials and the gang, where gangs will infuse themselves at every level of the political process. And so that if you rebuff, challenge, deny these people, there's an inherent political quality to those actions. And part of the strategy of terror under which they operate is to then subject people who are making these kinds of actions that are of political challenges, subjecting those people to harms that are as brutal as they are predictable. And it's not just to punish that individual. It is to convey a message to the larger community that says, if you challenge, rebuff us, thwart us, antagonize us, this is what's going to happen to you. It goes back to that terror strategy and establishing control, psychological control over these communities. Gender and LGBTQ issues are also extremely critical. One of the other fundamental pillars of this strategy of terror, you remember I mentioned one is the targeting of families. The other central most pillar is violence against females. This is absolutely critical to gangs' entire approach to operating, not just their personal identities, not just as expressions of extreme misogyny, but there's very strategic value behind the targeting of females. And this also applies to LGBTQ people. I see this most commonly in adolescence. Most at risk are gay males and transgender females. And also then you find lesbians are also subjected to harms because of their sexual orientation. So unraveling what's the sexual identity and orientation can be very, very important. Just a real quick note about LGBTQ people. Say you've got LGBTQ males. Once they've been threatened or subjected to harms from gang members because of their sexual orientation or identity, those males are then viewed and treated in the same way as females who have been subjected to harms. It's kind of a vulgar term, but the way I use it is they've been womanized. They are now treated as just the same way as females who have been subjected to sexual violence or these kinds of threats. So again, a lot of untangling that can go on within the gender and LGBTQ issue. Community context and internal relocation. When I talk about community context, gangs can exert more or less extreme levels of controls over communities. So getting a sense of the community, is this one that is truly owned and dominated by the gang, as is often the case? Or is it one where the government still has some kind of at least quasi-legitimate presence? And this really can matter in terms of people's response choices to the threats that they encounter from gangs. If this is a community that is owned from top to bottom by the gangs, and the police and the state may have no presence whatsoever, or if they do have a presence, it's so marginal as to be non-existent or operating in direct collusion with the gangs. That's a very different scenario than if you've got gang presence in a community where there is some at least quasi-legitimate state presence. A lot of this then ties into the internal relocation. And ever so briefly, what I say in testimony and declarations is that the nature of life in violence-affected areas of Central America is such that if you return to your previous neighborhood or small community, everybody knows you're back, including those who would cause your harm, especially gangs because they have, and other criminal groups, because they have an intelligence apparatus that exceeds that of the states. They know more about everybody than anybody that operates, that lives and moves in areas under their control. So if you return, everybody's going to know you're back, including of those of course, who would pose a harm to you. The alternative is you say, well, I can't go back to where I started, so I'm going to go somewhere else. Well, if that somewhere else is an area that's affected by gangs, drug traffickers, abusive state security personnel, you are immediately recognized as a stranger and a newcomer. And all of these actors, as well as just local residents, will descend upon you to figure out who you are, where you're from, why you're there, who you're connected to. And that information then begins to swirl around the new neighborhood or community. And pretty soon, people are talking about your presence to their nieces, to their brothers, to their whoever's in the same community that you fled. And it may be a matter of hours, days, or weeks before the people you flee now know of your whereabouts in the new community. There's more to say about this, but it's kind of the high-level overview. Government ability and willingness to protect. The short version of that is it doesn't exist, neither the ability nor the will. Myself and two colleagues last year published an article. We developed this concept called absent repressive criminalized states, Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Absent in terms of any meaningful state presence, the degree to which they are present in those communities, it tends to be a repressive, oftentimes violent presence vis-a-vis gang crackdown strategies known as mano dura. Most of you know that term. So they essentially add additional levels of violence to these already terribly fraught communities. And then there's also the criminalized presence, corruption, collusion with gangs, state officials and others being coerced into service to them, police, military, mayors, people of this sort. The end result is that those absent repressive criminalized state postures contribute very directly to the emergence and persistence of the very violent criminal groups that people are fleeing. So it becomes incoherent to argue that the same absent repressive criminalized states that create or contribute to the conditions that give rise to gangs are simultaneously going to be in a position to protect people who are removed to those very same conditions that the state itself contributes or creates. So the conditions don't exist. The internal structures, the institutional structures necessary to protect people at risk simply do not exist. It's not even enshrined into the operating principles of government. Finally, before we go into some country-specific stuff, you've really got to understand if the person has a criminal history either in their home country or in the United States, what might be the implications of that? Are they someone who is known or suspected either in their home country or in this country of being a gang member or gang associate? Do they have tattoos? Even if they're tattoos of an artistic nature that we would all recognize as just artsy tattoos. You go back to Central America and there's very little differentiation between artistic tattoos and gang tattoos. It's just not really baked in where like here, God knows what percentage of people under 35 and 40 have artistic tattoos. That's not part of the culture in Central America. So the presumption is that if you've got a tattoo, it's because you're a gang member. And all of this then leads to this question of what about the potential for state abuse, police, military primarily. So if we could kick on to the next slide. Just want to check the time and see where I'm at. Okay. I think we've touched on most of what we need to as far as gangs as political actors. But when I talk about that, what I mean is that they actively and routinely engage in activities that are typically associated with governance. Taxation is, or extortion is something that I refer to as an illegal system of parallel taxation that the government is neither willing nor able to control. It's very important to differentiate with extortion cases. Is this an extortion that's motivated purely by financial motives? Is it only to try and rake some money out of this person or family? Or is it the other dimension of extortion, which is largely unrecognized in this country and certainly unrecognized in the courts and the asylum office? In addition to financial motives, gangs use extortion to punish, terrorize, and control people that have fallen into disfavor. Oftentimes, there's a family dimension to this. There may be a religious or a political opinion dimension to it. But if there's an extortion element to a case, you really need to dedicate some time to figuring out, okay, was this just purely about money making, or was there an element of punishing, controlling, and terrorizing going on? And if so, that opens up some other doors that you need to begin to walk through. Gangs will impose curfews, traffic checkpoints. They will forcibly evict individuals, families, and at times entire communities from their homes. They will, in a way that's kind of upside down in a certain respect, also enforce social norms and mores. Like I know of women who were being abused by their intimate partners, where the police would do nothing. So the woman went to the local gang leader and said, hey, can you help me? My husband's beating me. The gang goes in there and sends a crew to set this guy straight. They're not, really what you would want to seek out as your protectors. But in cases where the state is entirely absent, it may be that the gangs are the only ones doing any kind of enforcement. And then they have this intelligence apparatus. So when I talk about them being political actors, this is what I'm referring to. Okay, so Amelia, let's move to the next one. Real quickly on the religiously based claims, this respect, conditional tolerance, and antipathy are different postures the gangs take towards the church. The US government has this really unbiased perception, or this very biased, limited perception that, oh, gangs have a respect we'll put in finger quotes, for the church. It's a very ill-informed, limited perspective. So there are times, yes, where this exists. If the gang leader's grandmother is active in the church and his mother goes to that church and he went to that church as a kid, and the pastor, the priest, the minister of the church is doing good work in the community that the gangs are supportive of, then yes, there may be a very legitimate sense of respect and even protecting the church from anyone that would do it harm. More often, what's construed as respect is more a conditional acceptance. Okay, we'll leave you alone, but don't be talking stuff that would be encroaching on our space. Don't start talking, you pastors and ministers and members of the laity, about rebuffing gang demands or abstinence or avoiding drug use and criminality and staying in school. Don't start creeping into our territory, or things could get ugly for you. Don't start holding festivals that are going to draw people in from other neighborhoods that we don't know and we don't want here. So it's tolerance. There's a tolerance, but that can be rescinded at any point depending on the actions of the clergy and the laity. And then there's outright antipathy, because many pastors and members of the cloth are out there engaging activities that are deemed direct confrontations to the gangs. Now, this leads to extremes of violence in the form of reprisals. It also can lead to people being coerced into service, like I mentioned before, not only because of the perception that, hey, everybody knows you're lily white and squeaky clean and a member of the church, so you can carry backpacks full of weed into the school for us, or traverse into other zones we can't enter into and do spying for us or deliver things for us without being suspected. But it's also perceived as like a symbolic blow against the church. If we can get a religious kid, coerce him or her into service, it's kind of like a symbolic strike against this institution that is oftentimes our nemesis. When I talk about the social visibility, for people who are devoutly religious and really engaged in their practice of faith, everybody in their community knows that, including the gangs. And it's very often a factor in these cases. Okay, Amelia? So now let's talk for just a little bit about each of the countries. Most of you are aware that the state of exception was declared, this regimen d'exception was declared in March of 22 in response to just a horrific outbreak of violence on the part of MS-13, where they randomly murdered 89 people over a 3-day period. At this point, over 80,000 people have been arrested, of which we know of this figure of over 3,000 are minors. Many of them have already been sentenced. Others are just in perpetual incarceration, awaiting hearings. We have no idea when their trials are even going to occur. Due process has been suspended entirely. Arrests are based on the most arbitrary and capricious grounds imaginable, such as a legitimate, legally recognized basis for arrest in El Salvador under the state of exception is nervousness when interacting with police. Well, how many people might be nervous when interacting with police, and does that have anything to do with whether you are gang affiliated? Part of what becomes so critical in all of these Salvadoran cases is this a young person who, for any of a number of different reasons, would be or could be construed as a gang member, gang affiliate, family member of a gang member, gang affiliate, family member of someone who has been arrested under the state of exception, LGBTQ, someone from a family who is politically active and opposed to the current government. Anything like this can become basis for arrest. And it's really critical to recognize that it is young people in the low-income sectors where the régimen d'exception is being primarily implemented that are at most at risk. And if I can just give you a quote from a conversation I was having with a colleague the other day. This is a US citizen who has lived in a gang-affected zone for over 10 years. And what this person said to me is, I'm watching my neighbors, who I know to have no involvement with gangs whatsoever, getting dragged out of their houses. And usually they don't come back. And when they do, they're in caskets. And the fear is so high in the communities that people don't even go to the funerals because the police are there taking pictures of everyone that's in attendance and then going and arresting them later for being gang collaborators. So this is that climate of fear. And really, it's the most massive systemic human rights abuse in modern Latin American history, but unfortunately is perceived by the US government as a legitimate crackdown that has effectively exterminated gangs. This is absolutely not the case. And this, more than anything else, gets attorneys coming out of the woodwork asking me questions. So if you have any more questions about this, feel free and I'll email me and I'll be happy to respond. So real quickly on to Honduras. They also have their own régimen d'exception, but it's really political sound and fury signifying, practically speaking, not much. None of the fanfare, none of the bombastic claims coming out of the administration of the effectiveness of the state of exception in exterminating gangs and crushing them out of existence. But it's really kind of a political dog and pony show because President Bukele in El Salvador, through the régimen d'exception there, has gathered enormous political capital, not just in El Salvador, but throughout Latin America. In fact, even into the US, where some of you may have heard this, he was invited as a keynote speaker to the CPAC conference in the United States in February and was given what was regarded as a rock star welcome. So this is he's accruing such political benefits that other leaders in Central America want some of that, and their populations are demanding that they implement a régimen d'exception. So this in Honduras is not playing out with the bombast that it is in El Salvador, but it is leading to extreme human rights abuses. Their two constitutional rights and due process have been suspended, and there are tremendous abuses associated with this. One thing that we have to concern ourselves with is that, like President Bukele in El Salvador, President Xiomara Castro in Honduras declared that she too was going to build a mega prison to house people arrested under the régimen d'exception. So any young person going back to Honduras that has a criminal record of any sort, potentially outstanding warrants, has been accused of gang affiliation, whether that's valid or not, in the US or Honduras, is really like at extremely high risk for arrest upon return. Okay, so Guatemala, and then we'll kind of wrap up with this piece. Guatemala has not bought into the state of exception kind of thing. But one of the biggest concerns with Guatemala that myself and others see in the courts is that in 2023, Bernardo Arevalo and Karen Herrera were elected on an anti-corruption platform. And the US government has taken the position that, there are now these two anti-corruption crusaders in the presidency in Guatemala, and they are just going to be cleaning house. They're going to be whipping out the corruption. They're going to be addressing issues of discrimination against the Mayan population, and they're just going to be pulling things into shape. And for all sorts of reasons that I just touched on here, that is absolutely not the case. The legal shenanigans that the corrupt elements of the Guatemalan government has engaged in to disempower the president and his vice president are just breathtaking. And we don't have time to go into them, but you really need to understand if you're going to confront arguments of, hey, well, there's a new sheriff in town and he's cleaning house. You need to do some drilling down and to see what that really means. The last thing I'll say about this Guatemala is you need to be very, very diligent in your exploration of this. Is this a Mayan person or a Ladino? And for those who may not be familiar with the word Ladino, that's just a non-Indigenous Mayan person or a non-Indigenous Mayan Guatemalan. Huge implications for the Mayan population, no matter what the tapestry of their case may look like. If they're Mayan, there's a whole host of particular concerns that come with that. So let me stop there, and Amelia, you can.
And so we do have some time to talk about those. And I did want to just say at the outset, you know, Tom mentioned he has shared his email, which was very kind of him. Thank you so much for that. CILA also is able to provide technical assistance for case-specific issues. So we would ask that you use that and if you have those. But we did get a couple questions for you, Tom, and so I'm going to read them out. The first one is, oftentimes clients say harm was caused by a member of a gang, but don't know the name of the gang. How do we present country conditions evidence on gangs if we don't know the name of the gang?
Well, this is a good question. It depends a lot. Young people will oftentimes be very sheltered within their homes. The adult caretakers will go to great lengths to protect them from scary, traumatizing, dangerous information. So oftentimes people legitimately don't know who the gang members are. Now, most people are going to know what gang controls their neighborhood because that's critical to being able to move about without putting yourself in a perilous situation by crossing over some gang boundary without knowing it. But oftentimes you can figure that out through, depending on how old the person is, you can ask some probative questions that'll help you narrow that down. What graffiti did they see? You know, what did they hear from their friends and other people about who the gang members were? It's oftentimes important to do calls, not only speak to the young person, but if you're able to connect up with their family members back home. And this is something I wanted to touch on, but your question relates directly. Information gets compartmentalized within families so that what the husband knows, the wife doesn't, what the parents know, the kids don't, what one sibling knows, the other don't, because information sharing is dangerous. And people are so conditioned to silence that people oftentimes lack an understanding of facts that are relevant to their own case because the people in their families are not talking about it. This is also true with like people from youth groups that are being harangued by gangs. They don't tell each other about this stuff. So it's often very, very critical to talk to the adults in young people's lives that are in this country or back in the home country if you're able to make those connections, because those adults are typically able to provide information that the young people can't. The other thing, if I could say this, Amelia,
Yeah.
oftentimes it is impossible to determine what gang it was. Like I just finished a declaration yesterday where there's been gang warfare going on, so that who controls the gang literally this week or what gang controls this area this week could be different the next. And the thing I always emphasize is, number one, it's not always possible to know. And number two, it doesn't matter. Whether you're talking about MS-13 or DS-8 or some of the more localized gangs, they're the same animal, different spots. You know, and I've said before in testimony, if you're walking through an area and this slobbering, drooling, vicious dog is running after you to tear the flesh off your bones, do you really care what breed it is? No, it doesn't matter which gang it is. Their mentality is the same. Their tactics are the same. The violence they express is the same.
Thank you for that, Tom. Yeah, we've had actually several more come in. I'm gonna just say in advance, I'm not sure we're gonna have time to address them all. We'll try to get through a few more though. Again, please do follow up with either CILA, Tom, if we're not able to get to your question. One that was asked that I don't know if this is in your wheelhouse or not, Tom, but I thought I would raise is, do you know the age of majority in each of these countries?
Each of them are either 18 or something really close to 18. And some of them have different ages of majority for different things, like an age of majority for a woman or a female to enter into a relationship can be different than the age of majority of pure adulthood. So yeah, I don't remember exactly what the ages are for the different things, but they're all right around 18, if not 18.
Great, thank you. We also had a question on how can attorneys argue that the government is unable or unwilling to protect in the case of Honduras or El Salvador, considering that the state of exception?
Good question. Mano dura legislation that's been in place in the region since, depending on which country, the early 2000s, literally does not include one single syllable about protecting people at risk. These are police military repression suppression strategies in which gang membership has been criminalized itself independently of other acts, enhanced sentencing, but there is nothing in those laws that addresses protecting people at risk. And this is a critical question I included in every declaration and most times testimony. The other thing that's important is that implementing law enforcement strategies against gangs requires a particular set of resources, institutional structures, experiences, mindsets, conceptual frameworks. The mindsets, resources, institutional structures, experiences necessary to develop and implement a continuum of protective mechanisms for people at risk from gangs is entirely different. I say in testimony, they're like railroad tracks that run parallel, but will never touch. So mano dura is not synonymous with an ability or willingness to protect.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more. And again, I know that we have more than that in the chat, and I apologize that we just don't have time to get to them all, but please do follow up with us or Tom if it is something in his wheelhouse or ours. But we did have a question, Tom, of what successful arguments have you seen to show contacting authorities is futile for clients who have never contacted authorities or sought protection from the government?
Well, one of the most commonly recognized things in society in Central America, and it's also very well documented through quite exhaustive literature in the United States and other countries, is that the levels of corruption and collusion with gangs and other criminal groups, the resource scarcity, the lack of training, the sheer overwhelm of security officials, police, military, prosecutors, judges, is such that, I mean, the literature is absolutely exhaustive, that the majority of people in Central America, number one, view going to the police or prosecutors as futile, and number two, view it as dangerous, because those institutions are what I refer to as leaky vessels. So let's say you seek out a police officer in Honduras who happens to be a person of integrity and professionalism, and that person then generates some documents on your behalf as part of your complaint. Well, those documents go into the system. Nobody has control over what happens to those documents once they get in the system. And one thing that if you're dealing with people who live in Central America in these zones or experts who work in them will tell you is that if you report gangs to police or go directly to the public prosecutor's office, which is an option, it is at least 50% likely that those state officials that you seek assistance from are going to report back to the gangs that you have done so. So there is a huge body of literature that verifies this, and people could reach out to me directly if they wanted to, if they, wanted to try to track some of that down.
Great, thank you. All All right, well, that is, oh yeah, go ahead. One more thing.
There may be
Mhm.
another question, but there's a point that overarches absolutely everything in one's exploration and development of these cases. And I just skimmed over it real quickly. In areas that are so affected by violence, and we're talking about generations and generations and generations of exposure to such extremes of violence, the population is so conditioned to silence that nobody wants to talk about this stuff. People are often so traumatized that they're unable or unwilling to discuss their own experiences. They can go to their family members and say, "Hey, mom, I'm sitting here with my attorney in Washington, D.C., and we need to know some things." And the mother may not want to disclose anything because, number one, she's afraid to talk on the phone, and she doesn't want to traumatize her child by telling her what's been going on. So it's far more art than science. But myself and a colleague are actually working on an article right now, just trying to help people like attorneys and advocates and CBP officials and asylum officers and judges figure out how to navigate some of these communication challenges. But one thing you can't do is, well, you can, but it's not likely to be fruitful. Don't expect to say to your client, "Okay, call home and ask what's been going on since you left. Have they been looking for you? They've been threatening other members of the family. We need to know what's been going on since you left home 3 years ago." Your client may not even call home, but tell you that he or she did because they don't want to put their family at risk. Or they may call home and they talk, chit chat, but they never get to the core issues because nobody talks about this stuff. There's ways to deal with this. They're not guaranteed, but it's a significant challenge in these cases, is how to overcome those obstacles to communication.
Yes, thank you so much. And really, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I don't know if you saw, but I saw that a lot of people shared their things in the chat, which we appreciate. This has been an amazing amount of information, and we're so grateful again for you joining us, spending your time with us, and for all the work you're doing in these countries. So thank you. I am going to move us to the next part and the final part of our presentation today. We are going to talk a little bit more about how to get involved. If after hearing about what's happening for children in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, you find this, you're inspired or you're interested and you want to learn more, and perhaps you're interested in taking a case, again, we really encourage you to check out CILA's Pro Bono Matters platform. There's lots of available opportunities on there. Those include some of the ones here on the slide, which are actually for children from Honduras, Guatemala, or El Salvador who are fleeing gang violence. A lot of these might be taking a full representation case, and I know that for some people it can feel a little bit overwhelming or perhaps scary if you're new to this area of law for taking a case, but please know that for any attorney who's considering it, it really does make a difference for the child to have an attorney. And I'll just speak from my own experience. I was in private practice as a civil litigator, and I actually initially became involved in children's immigration as a pro bono attorney. And it was an amazing, I could see how just being able to use my skills as a lawyer would make a huge difference. And of course, a lot of the organizations that post are also offering mentorship, and that can be a huge help in the case. And so we encourage you to check it out, maybe even connect with the organizations if you have questions about a particular case or about other pro bono opportunities. We definitely encourage that. I also want to highlight 2 opportunities that are available remote, nationwide, and for which no law license is required. So that means if you're a law student in particular, I would encourage you to check these out. One is with our sister project at the ABA Commission on Immigration. It is the Immigrant Justice Project in San Diego, California. And this is an opportunity to help them with conducting country conditions research for asylum cases. So looking into all these different issues that we've been talking about here today, which is very important evidence, like Serena mentioned, for the case. So if you're interested, I think we're going to share some of their information in the chat, but you can also check out the links on the slide. The other opportunity is with the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. And as I mentioned, we're really grateful because they were actually able to join us here today to talk about it. So I am actually going to turn it over to Delaney, and she's going to share a little bit more about their pro bono program.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful for CILA for inviting me to join, and thank you, Tom, for all of that incredible information. I know we're getting right down to the end of our time, and y'all have soaked up a lot, so I'll try to keep it pretty brief for you all. But I'm Delaney. I'm our Pro Bono Programs Manager here at the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. And I'd love to share a little bit more about our work and how you can get involved. So NMILC's mission is to advance justice and equity by empowering low-income immigrant communities through collaborative legal services, advocacy, and education. And we have quite a spread of work including the spectrum of humanitarian-based immigration relief and advocacy on the state and federal levels. And we invite everyone to get involved in our work. We have a lot of remote pro bono opportunities, and they're based here in New Mexico, but there are a lot of reasons why it makes sense to lend a hand to us here in the Southwest. So you can go to the next slide. Like I mentioned, we run the spectrum of humanitarian-based immigration relief in our services, in addition to citizenship, residency, DACA, and economic justice work. And all of our legal services are free to low-income immigrant communities throughout the whole state of New Mexico. You may or may not know that New Mexico has one of the smallest state bars. We have just over 8,000 attorneys, 1,000 of which are licensed here but work in other states. So that means that there are only 26 attorneys for every 10,000 New Mexico residents. And as you can imagine, there's a huge need in New Mexico as a border state. NMILC is currently the only immigration law nonprofit that provides this spectrum of free legal services in the community. So without our services, low-income immigrants would not otherwise be able to obtain these services, and we really can't do it without pro bono support and volunteer support. So next slide, please. So there are quite a few ways to get involved, and with our focus today on Asylum, I want to focus on that volunteer opportunity. It's a remote opportunity, and we offer both pro se assistance and direct rep. So I saw a couple of questions in the chat. If law students can get involved, absolutely. Please fill out our volunteer form and consider getting involved in our work, no matter where in the country you are, or even out of the country. So yeah, we provide free pro bono assistance to asylum seekers, and we really can't do that work without our volunteer support. One example of our work was with our asylum, or our Afghan Pro Se Plus asylum workshop model, which served over 300 individuals, and 69 of them secured asylum, which is a huge success for us. And we've just worked down our wait list of the adjustment of statuses for all of those folks, and those were all done by volunteers. So building off of the success of this Afghan Pro Se Plus asylum model, we're now developing that model for all of our asylum pro se work, so that in addition to volunteers supporting with the I-589, we're also doing more robust education about asylum, declaration, development assistance, and evidence gathering, so that we can help families better understand asylum law and prepare them as much as possible to win their claims before immigration judges, even if they're unrepresented. So we saw some great examples on the CILA Pro Bono Matters forum that Amelia was sharing. I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat some of our specific case cards just the direct links to those that are of some of the common case types that we're seeing that are actually with quite a lot of Venezuelan families and Colombian families who are fleeing violence and experiencing persecution in their countries of origin. And I'll just mention briefly, there are other ways to get involved in our work. I've been talking about our remote asylum pro se workshops. We also have detention advocacy work, remote translation needs, and then some direct rep options for any attorneys who want to get involved. So there's asylum, direct rep options, and special immigrant juvenile status, which we often have case cards up on the CILA platform for SIJS as well. And we have also a very robust pro bono attorney program for SIJS. So we can just click through the next slide. We do provide training and mentorship to all of our volunteers and pro bonos. Pro bono attorneys get malpractice insurance through NMILC. We provide interpretation, and it's pretty flexible. So we have ongoing remote opportunities and lots of options to sort of fit your needs that way. So go ahead and scan this QR code, click on our case cards through the CILA platform. You can also get in touch with me. I can throw my email in the chat as well, but it'll also be on my last slide. So the next slide is just appreciation to all of our pro bonos and volunteers. Like I've mentioned already, we cannot do the work without you all. Your support is so meaningful, and we're endlessly grateful for folks from out of state who want to give their support to here in New Mexico. Lastly, just if you want to follow our work at the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center, I'll put our handles in the chat, and then this is my information so that you can reach out to me if you have further questions about getting involved and want to get in touch. So thank you all so much. I appreciate your time, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Delaney. We're so glad you're able to join us to share. It's always great to hear from the organizations themselves who have the opportunities. It moved a little fast. There might have been some questions for you in the chat. Again, if Delaney didn't answer them already, please do follow up with her. These slides, including Delaney's slides with her contact information, are on the training webpage, which has the PDFs of the slides, so you can get in touch with her, like she said. Also a reminder that the training webpage has our handout, which has more information as well about all of the organizations that post cases on CILA's platform, as well as CILA's resources, and specifically resources for asylum cases, but also just anything related to working with children on immigration cases. We've kind of compiled a go-to list here to help people who might be interested in learning more or getting started on a case. And we do have a video featured here where you can hear directly from some of the youth who came from Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras, and they talk specifically about their experiences. And so I encourage you to check these out. We also wanted to share just some general resources about country conditions. Again, if you are interested in getting involved more in this work, in particular, there is that project with the Immigrant Justice Project, which I shared on the slide earlier. There's a link to it. Again, check it out in the PDF if you're interested. But these are some places you can go to look into information, as well as working with experts like Tom or looking at news articles and other things. We have about a minute left, so I'm going to very quickly wrap us up. Most importantly, we do have a feedback survey for today, which we ask you to please complete. My colleague is going to put it in the chat, but it will also pop up in the email. I think it's going to pop up when the CLE or the webinar closes. And then I am, of course, going to send that follow-up email. The feedback survey will be there, as is going to be the attendance confirmation form. For those of you looking for CLE, we really hope that you've enjoyed our webinar today, and we thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. Please stay in touch with us. Again, we have social media too that you can connect with. And with that, I think we're exactly at time. So we're going to end it. Thank you.